You've spent years laughing at Stewie's obsession with taking over the world and clearing everyone in his way, including his family, especially during the early episodes of Family Guy. And the show was completely fine with that because while you're laughing, it was burying one of the most important warnings in human history right under the jokes. Stewie, arguably the greatest and most dangerous science protege the world has ever seen, built time machines, mind control devices, and teleporters. But instead of a Nobel Prize or at least a spotlight on the evening TV, he only gets pats on the head and a dirty diaper. All because his god-tier mind is trapped in the body of an infant. It's hilarious, especially when his world-ending threats are translated as goo goo gaga. Until you realize the joke isn't Stewie. The joke's on us, the viewers. Because the more everyone played his evil intentions off as weird baby stuff, the more locked in he got. A crossbow here, a mind control device there, each invention darker than the last. Put yourself in Stewie's shoes for a second. Imagine you have a vocabulary that would embarrass most academics and an IQ that spans galaxies, but you're still supposed to sit on a high chair for hours and hours every single day, listening to idiotic babble while no one listens to you or cares about your brilliant ideas. You look at your mom, Lois, the woman who's supposed to be your primary witness. Anytime you try to connect with her by explaining some advanced science, she's never impressed, because she doesn't seem to care about your ambitions. She just wants a normal, obedient baby. She doesn't even pretend to check the equations. Trust me, that would make Stewie really happy. But all the science and maths is way out of Lois's comfort zone, so she won't even try. Every time she coos at you while you're holding a weapon of mass destruction, it seems cute, but she indirectly overlooks you and your abilities. Then there's Peter, your father. Lois overlooks Stewie, alright, but at least she provides all his basic baby needs. Peter is so dumb, the only sign that he's a grown-up is his fat belly.
Peter, maybe Stewie would like to play fort too.
No! If you need me, I'll be in space.
He doesn't even realize he's living with a genius. He'll use one of Stewie's high-tech weapons as a bottle opener or a back scratcher without even realizing he's holding the pinnacle of human engineering. He is the most naive man in the world. It's like being a chess grandmaster forced to live with a man who tries to eat the pieces. I don't know about you, but that would piss me off every second of the day. To the rest of the world, strangers at the park or the grocery store, you're just another cute accessory in a stroller. You could scream a sophisticated military strategy and they just pinch your cheek and ask if you want a cracker. The nonchalance of almost everyone in Quahog is beyond infuriating. The world around Stewie is addicted to the status quo and they're not ready for a new challenge. Definitely not one as big as Stewie's brain, so they choose to ignore it to protect their peace. So, while Stewie is building the future in his bedroom, the people around him are too busy clinging to a mediocre present to notice. On paper, it's certain this should discourage him. If no one's paying attention, why bother? But it only moves Stewie to do more and more damage. Just look at the episode where he tried to kill Lois multiple times.
The hell are you? How did you get here?
Oh, there's a very simple answer to that. You drove me here, Lois, with all the indignities I've been forced to suffer day in and day out under your matriarchal tyranny.
His first attempt with his flying drill only missed by millimeters. His early actions point to the fact that dismissing capable people doesn't make them go away, it makes them go underground, far beyond the eyes of smaller minds and even further against their interests. And as much as I'd like to take credit for discovering this, it's not just my theory or good cartoon writing. It's a real-life pattern, and it shows up in ways that are a lot less funny than a baby with a ray gun. I've actually been spending a lot of time lately obsessing over the stories of these sideline geniuses. And the hard truth is, when society limits or ignores talent based on credentials or how someone looks, whether that's age, race, or social connections, it doesn't eliminate that talent. It just guarantees that the talent will no longer work for the benefit of the system that rejected it. It turns a potential asset into an unpredictable liability. Vivian Thomas, the man who helped pioneer open heart surgery while being classified as a janitor, is a perfect example of that. In 1930, a 19-year-old black man in Nashville lost his college savings when the bank failed during the Great Depression. His plan to become a doctor evaporated overnight, but his talent and passions didn't. After a while, he found work as a laboratory assistant to a surgeon named Alfred Blaylock at Vanderbilt University, and within months, he was performing surgical procedures on his own. Within a few years, he was doing work at the level of a postdoctoral researcher. So, did his dreams finally come true? Oh, you don't know the half of it. The problem is, even with all his medical breakthroughs, he had to remain a janitor. His skill wasn't in question, it all came down to what a black man was allowed to be in the 1940s. A nobody. When Blaylock moved to Johns Hopkins and helped pioneer what became the Blue Baby operation, a surgery that saved thousands of infants born with a deadly heart defect, the techniques he used were Vivian Thomas's. The instrument design was Vivian Thomas's. On the first day of surgery, Thomas stood at Blaylock's shoulder in the operating theater, walking him through the procedure step by step. Blaylock later admitted to the public that Thomas's suture lines were so precise they looked like quote-unquote something the Lord made. From there, Thomas started gaining recognition, and for 30 years, he trained the surgeons who became the leaders of cardiac medicine across America. His portrait now hangs in the Johns Hopkins Medical Building right next to the surgeons he taught. He finally received an honorary doctorate in 1976, even though he had been doing doctorate-level work since 1930. Vivian Thomas's story ends well, relatively speaking, but think about what it cost. 30 years of putting in the work without any credit because of his identity. 30 years of being the hand behind the hand that got the recognition. Now ask yourself, what if Vivian Thomas didn't have the patience for that? What if he'd looked at the system and decided if it wasn't going to reward him through legitimate channels, he'd find a different kind of leverage entirely? Because he could. He held the literal hearts of the elite in his hands. He was the only one in the room who truly knew how the machinery of life worked. He could have engineered a surgical complication that no one would have been able to question. That's where it gets dark. Not everyone is as patient as Vivian. Over the years, some geniuses learned that they had to force the world to respect them after being ignored for years. Someone like Klaus Fuchs is the ultimate proof of what happens when a brilliant mind feels alienated by the very superiors he's working for. Fuchs was a German theoretical physicist who fled Nazi persecution in 1933 and rebuilt his life in Britain. He was brilliant, earned a PhD from Bristol, and became one of the top nuclear physicists in the country. When World War II came around, the British and Americans needed minds like his to build the atomic bomb. So, they recruited him into the Manhattan Project. He was one of the lead scientists on the plutonium bomb. He was at Trinity when they tested it, and he was at Los Alamos for the hydrogen bomb research. Little did the United States and British intelligence know that he was sending every single secret he could get his hands on to the Soviet Union. Klaus Fuchs thought one nation having unchecked nuclear supremacy was a global catastrophe waiting to happen. So he decided to level the playing field. He handed Moscow a blueprint for the most destructive weapon ever built. The actions of this one man feeling abandoned by the system created the nuclear standoff that defined the second half of the 20th century. He didn't have to lead a protest or bomb a building. He went back to work every single day, smiled at his colleagues, and rewrote the geopolitical order of the world from the inside. Ted Kaczynski, the Unabomber, did the same, but with 10 times the passion. He went as far as declaring a one-man war on the civilization that molded him. Ted Kaczynski enrolled at Harvard at 16 as one of the most promising mathematics students the university had ever seen. He went on to earn a PhD from Michigan and became an assistant professor at Berkeley. On paper, the system had embraced him. He had every credential, every institutional stamp of approval, but something had been happening underneath that surface for years. At Harvard at 17, he was enrolled in a CIA mind control program called MKUltra, disguised as a psychological study. Hours of sustained, calculated, personal verbal attacks designed to break him down under the guise of research. He spent 200 hours in that study. He later talked about how much he hated the researchers, the experience of being treated as a test subject rather than a human, by the very institution that was supposed to be developing him, never fully left him. He left Berkeley in 1969 without explanation, moved to a one-room cabin in Montana with no electricity or running water, and spent the next 26 years building the most sophisticated solo domestic terrorism campaign in American history. Kaczynski, or Uncle Ted as the boys on 4chan like to call him, wanted to reverse industrial development and return humanity to an anarcho-primitivist hunter-gatherer state. So he targeted universities and research institutions in order to literally stop technological advancements. He planted 16 bombs that killed 3 people and injured 23. It took 17 years before the FBI even got close to identifying him. The only reason he was caught was because his brother recognized his writing style in the manifesto that he forced the New York Times and Washington Post to publish. The Unabomber wasn't random. His targets were people he believed were advancing the technology that he thought was destroying human freedom. He wrote a 35,000-word manifesto that serious academics have compared to legitimate political philosophy. That doesn't make him right, but it tells you something about what a mind that size does with a grievance that large. He felt used and he lashed out. But not every resentful genius works in physics or geopolitics. I've already said it, but we have to drop all stereotypes to see people for what they truly are and can become. They appear in all spheres of life. I mean, who would have imagined that Marvin Heemeyer, a common welder, would someday create a one-of-one model of destruction, the Killdozer? Marvin was just a muffler shop owner in Granby, Colorado, until the government made the mistake of ignoring him. They approved a concrete plant right next to his shop, blocking his access road and diverting stormwater onto his property. They didn't even care to compensate him. Instead, they fined him for being there in the first place. He was literally getting fined for existing. So, Marvin did what any reasonable person would do. He fought back legally. He wrote letters, filed appeals, and showed up to every meeting, and took it all the way to the EPA. But the town kept ruling against him. After exhausting all options, he decided to take the law into his own hands. In 2003, he sold part of his property to fund the revenge mission. He then spent the next year and a half secretly converting a Komatsu bulldozer into something that defies imagination. He welded inch-thick steel armor plating over the entire machine. He poured concrete between layers of steel to make it impervious to bullets and explosives. He mounted cameras to the outside covered by 3-inch bulletproof glass and linked them to monitors inside so he could navigate while completely sealed in. He built gun ports into it too. It's so impressive that he built this entirely in secret, inside a false wall in his own shop, with workers and visitors nearby who never noticed a thing. Then on June 4th, 2004, Marvin Heemeyer introduced the Killdozer to the world. He started the engine and drove it straight through the wall. For 127 minutes, he methodically checked off 13 buildings on his list, demolishing all of them, including the town hall, the police station, the newspaper that had written editorials about his disputes, the concrete plant he blamed for everything, and the hardware store whose owner had sued him. He wrecked every single one of these buildings. He was basically invincible till he finally got stuck in the basement. Once stuck, he took his own life before anyone could reach him. The estimated damage was over $7 million, but he didn't take anyone's life other than his own. Before he did it, he recorded 3 hours of audio explaining everything.
And I'm carrying the cross willingly now. At first, I fought it. But it has to be done.
He wasn't disorganized or deranged. He just decided that if the normal channels wouldn't hear him, he would build something that couldn't be ignored. He left a note that read, "I was always willing to be reasonable until I had to be unreasonable." The welding skills that gave him a livelihood gave him a weapon. The patience and precision that made him good at his job made him terrifyingly effective at his revenge. The talent and the grievance were inseparable. These guys are all sidelined in their own way, but there's one man who is the perfect parallel to Stewie's habit of seeing the world as his plaything. His actions are exactly like the consequences of the world treating a genius like a child, which was exactly what everyone did to Stewie. He decided to prove that geniuses were operating on a plane far above everyone else. Bernays was Sigmund Freud's nephew. Twice over, actually. His mother was Freud's sister, and his father's sister was Freud's wife. Sigmund, being the father of psychoanalysis, you can imagine the head start Bernays had on understanding the human mind. Oh, the things I would have done to be at those family dinners. So while Freud spent his career trying to understand the human mind, Bernays spent his figuring out how to control it. From a very early age, Bernays realized that if you understood how crowds think, how people form opinions, how emotion overrides reason, you could engineer consent. You could make people believe things, want things, vote for things, without them ever knowing they'd been manipulated into it. He had to prove it to be sure, though. The opportunity came in 1929. The tobacco industry hired Bernays to get women smoking in public, something society considered deeply taboo at the time. So, Bernays hired a group of women to march in the Easter Day parade in New York, cigarettes in hand, and told the press they were lighting torches of freedom, symbols of women's liberation. The story ran everywhere, and women's tobacco purchases skyrocketed. Bernays invented what we now call public relations, but he called it by its honest name in his 1928 book, Propaganda. He wrote openly that the masses could and should be manipulated by the intelligent minority who knew how. He believed democracy could only function if public opinion was managed from above by people who understood it better than the public did. His book became a blueprint for every political manipulation campaign of the 20th century, including, to his immense shock, Nazi Germany. This must have been deeply ironic because Bernays was Jewish, and all the methods that he had spent his entire career perfecting had ended up in the hands of Joseph Goebbels, who was using them to campaign against Jewish Germans. When a journalist broke the news to him, Bernays was horrified. He hadn't intended that outcome, but he built the tool, put it in the world, and described in detail how it worked. Bernays is proof that ignored geniuses will do absolutely anything to accumulate power, but they're so consumed by the need to prove themselves that they never stop to think about how it could bite them in the butt. One mind decided that masses should be manipulated and wrote the manual. That single decision shaped advertising, politics, public health campaigns, corporate communications, and authoritarian propaganda for 100 years, even up until now. Most of the people affected have no idea who Bernays was. That was, by design, the point. Now these twisted geniuses, there's something they have in common. Fuchs was caught. Kaczynski was identified because of his own brother. Heemeyer announced himself with a Killdozer through a wall. Bernays published a book and gave interviews about it for 70 years. They were all, in their own ways, catchable. Either because they got sloppy, because someone gave them up, or because, crucially, a part of them wanted to be known. But what about the ones who want to stay secret for life? What about a mind smart enough to decide that the goal wasn't the statement or the rampage that people could point to and identify? We would have no idea. And I'm not talking about anyone specific, that's the whole point. I wouldn't know. Think about it. The Manhattan Project had a small city worthy of the most brilliant scientists alive, surrounded by military-grade security, and Klaus Fuchs walked in and out with blueprints for 7 years. The FBI spent $50 million and 17 years failing to identify a man who mailed them letters and signed them FC. Marvin Heemeyer built an armored tank in his own shop for 18 months without anyone noticing. These are the people who later got caught or identified. A sufficiently motivated and careful genius working alone, operating on a measured timeline. What they could do is genuinely beyond our wildest imaginations. If they succeeded, you wouldn't guess it's an attack, it would just look like something else. An accident, a coincidence, a natural failure, a disease, an infrastructure collapse. It could be anything. We don't know who these people are because we can't. But the absence of a trace is in itself the answer. Just imagine if Stewie went through with his plan to unleash a global electromagnetic pulse via his satellite laser network. Who could have traced it back to him? The only thing everyone would have seen is a sudden, continent-wide blackout with no warning, satellites blinking out in sequence, power grids collapsing like dominoes. The government would have to call it like a massive solar flare / geomagnetic storm just to look like they have it covered. Family Guy never asks this question literally, but Stewie's early seasons raise it every single episode. What are the consequences of a world that systematically ignores its most capable people? And how many of those consequences have we already experienced without ever knowing what they actually were? The easy answer is, we'll never know. But the best answer should be a response from every single one of us. If there's even a tiny chance to prevent these problems around us, we have to take note of Stewie's story. How did Stewie stop being a murderous supervillain? Because something did change, and it's worth understanding what. It wasn't punishment, it definitely wasn't discipline. Not Lois threatening him, Peter being clueless, the family cycling through the same dynamics they always had. None of that touched him. He was immune to all of it. The biggest difference was his dog and best friend, Brian. Brian didn't treat Stewie as an intellectual equal exactly, since Brian was never going to keep up with him on that level, and both of them knew it. but Brian was the first person in Stewie's world who actually engaged with him and acknowledged his intelligence. Brian was willing to be his friend without needing him to be something smaller first. Brian didn't try to pat him on the head or patronize him. He sat down next to Stewie and had a conversation. A relationship that acknowledged him. Not his plans, not his threat level, but him. That started dismantling the architecture of resentment he'd been building since before he could walk. This fostered his emotional dependency, something Stewie was never exposed to. Brian became his confidant, adventure partner, and the one person he could be vulnerable with, sharing fears and dreams beyond domination. As Brian entered his life as a real presence, the matricide obsession faded. The world domination schemes became more absurd and less cold. The emotional range expanded. Eventually, the Stewie who wanted to destroy everything became the Stewie who had traveled through time to bring Brian back to life after he died in an accident.
I think my timeline is being erased. The timeline where you died no longer exists. Merry Christmas, Brian.
He actually grieved Brian's death like a lost piece of himself. The transformation began the moment someone saw him. Just like there are examples of geniuses that chose to burn the world because of their unfair treatment, there are others like Stewie that chose to focus on one positive over millions of negatives around them. Nikola Tesla, for example, built the foundations of the modern electrical world. He gave us alternating current, the entire power infrastructure that runs contemporary civilization. Edison largely stole credit from him. Businessmen systematically stripped his funding and he died alone in a New York hotel room, broke and dismissed, with pigeons he'd made friends with as his main company. But he didn't turn, he kept working. His last significant project was trying to build a wireless energy system that would give free power to the entire planet. His motivation, even when the world had done everything it could to diminish him, was still about giving something rather than taking something back. The difference between the people who turned and the people who didn't isn't intelligence or opportunity. In many cases, it isn't even the severity of what they experienced. It's whether somewhere in their story, someone actually saw them before the damage became irreversible. Tesla had, for a period, the genuine admiration of other scientists even when the commercial world had abandoned him. Brian sat down next to Stewie and was there for him. Same story with the way Alfred Blaylock stood by Vivian Thomas and fought for him within a system that didn't want to. The reverse is the case for Kaczynski, who entered that Harvard study at 17, a boy who was already struggling socially and spent 200 hours being systematically broken down by the institution that was supposed to develop him. He was bound to go rogue. It's simple. Isolation and dismissal applied to intelligence and capability over time produces a specific kind of catastrophic outcome. Recognition, real recognition, prevents this. Who knows if Alfred Nobel had it in mind while creating the Nobel Peace Prize? I mean, Nobel himself was a man whose genius was used to create dynamite, a tool intended for mining. Instead, it became a weapon of mass slaughter. He was famously horrified when he read his own premature obituary, which titled him the Merchant of Death. He probably realized that if he didn't create a system to recognize and reward those who contributed to the greatest benefit of mankind, his legacy and the legacy of countless other geniuses would be nothing but destruction. Now, I'm not even sure it's a coincidence that Trump authorized 7 B-2 stealth bombers to drop bunker buster bombs on Iran barely 24 hours after ranting on Truth Social about everything he had done to deserve the Nobel Peace Prize. Now, would giving Trump a Nobel Peace Prize have stopped him from starting the current Iran war? Probably not, but even the 1% chance of it would make for an interesting alternate reality. Now, it doesn't actually matter whether you see Trump as a genius or not. He clearly believes himself to be one, and he has a tremendous amount of power, which he uses on anyone who annoys him. Perhaps we should have been nicer. When we mock and malign people, we don't give them a reason to cooperate with us. Whether it's Stewie, Trump, or Uncle Ted, people like these tend to respond to any perceived disrespect with extreme measures. Family Guy was trying to warn you. The baby with the death ray is a cartoon, but the resentment beneath is very real. I've been preaching against parental negligence since day one. There's a reason Lois Griffin is classed under my top 5 worst cartoon mothers in my video on most loved versus most hated cartoon mothers. Check it out to find out the other 4, because as crazy as it sounds, there are 3 mothers worse than Lois.